August 1962, when the estate sale crew entered Marilyn Monroe's Brentwood home 3 weeks after her death, they expected to find what America had always imagined: closets full of tight dresses, drawers overflowing with makeup, maybe some love letters from famous men. Instead, they discovered something that made no sense according to everything Hollywood had sold the public for 16 years. 400 books. Not coffee table decorations or unread gifts, but worn paperbacks with dog-eared pages, margins filled with handwritten notes, passages underlined in multiple colors. Dostoyevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, with annotations in Marilyn's handwriting discussing theology and morality. James Joyce's Ulysses, one of the most challenging novels in English literature, marked throughout with her observations. Volumes of poetry by Whitman, Sandburg, and Eliot. Philosophy texts by Freud and Nietzsche. The crew photographed the library before the auction, and those images would remain buried in estate files for decades because they contradicted the most profitable lie Hollywood ever sold. The dumb blonde didn't exist. She never had. Marilyn Monroe had been playing the greatest acting role of her career every time she pretended not to understand the very industry that was exploiting her intelligence. And the tragedy wasn't that she died young. The tragedy was that she spent her entire adult life hiding the thing that might have saved her: her mind. Before we explore this hidden chapter of Marilyn Monroe's life, if you're interested in the untold stories behind Hollywood's biggest icons, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. The library discovered in Marilyn's home wasn't a recent acquisition. It was the accumulated evidence of a 15-year secret project, a parallel life she'd been living since her first success as a contract player at Fox. Among the books catalogued by the estate were volumes dating back to 1947, early editions purchased before Hollywood had decided who Marilyn Monroe would be allowed to become. There were philosophy texts with purchase dates from 1950, when she was still doing bit parts, already reading Spinoza and Schopenhauer while studio publicity departments were teaching her to giggle on cue. The annotations throughout these books told a story Hollywood had spent millions ensuring the public would never hear. In her copy of Milton's Paradise Lost, Marilyn had written extensive margin notes comparing Satan to the Hollywood studio system, both presenting servitude as freedom, both punishing those who dared to think independently. Her edition of Lincoln Steffen's autobiography was filled with underlined passages about power structures and institutional lies with her handwritten observation: "They do this in Hollywood too, but nobody investigates because everyone's complicit." These weren't the musings of someone trying to appear intellectual. They were the private thoughts of a deeply engaged mind, working through complex ideas in solitude, because expressing them publicly would have destroyed the image that paid her bills. What the estate sale crew didn't know, what researchers would uncover decades later, was that the 400 books they'd catalogued represented only part of her intellectual life. She'd been taking extension courses at UCLA under a false name, studying literature and history, sitting in the back of lecture halls wearing dark glasses and plain clothes, desperate for education in an industry that profited from her appearing uneducated. Professor Martha Wolfenstein, who taught a course on 19th-century Russian literature in 1954, would later recall a blonde woman who always sat alone, who wrote papers of remarkable insight about Tolstoy and Turgenev. When Wolfenstein saw photographs of Marilyn Monroe years later, she recognized the quiet student who'd called herself Norma Baker and who'd written a 15-page analysis of Anna Karenina. But Marilyn had made her promise never to acknowledge their connection, because in Hollywood's mythology, intelligence and sexuality were incompatible in women. The systematic suppression of Marilyn's intelligence began almost immediately after she signed with 20th Century Fox in 1946. Her first publicity interviews showed a young woman who spoke in complete sentences, who referenced books she'd read. The studio publicity department called her in. She was trying too hard. Audiences didn't go to movies to feel intimidated by actresses who were smarter than they were. Men wanted to fantasize about women who needed them, who posed no intellectual threat, so the studio constructed a character for her to play in public: Marilyn Monroe, the girl who was pretty but not bright, sexy but not threatening. They taught her to pause before answering questions, as if thinking was difficult. They instructed her to ask men to explain simple concepts, to laugh at jokes she didn't find funny. They even adjusted her speaking voice, adding that breathy quality that would become her trademark, and Marilyn, who'd grown up poor and desperate and willing to do whatever survival required, learned the performance so well that eventually even people who knew her personally couldn't tell where the act ended and the real person began. In 1952, during an interview, Marilyn mentioned that she was reading Emerson's essays. The studio's publicity chief summoned her immediately. Reading Emerson was fine, as long as she never mentioned it again. Audiences needed to believe she spent her free time shopping and doing her nails, not engaging with American philosophy. When she protested that lying about her interests felt degrading, he explained the economics with brutal clarity. Fox had $300 million invested in her image as a sex symbol. Every time she revealed her actual intelligence, she damaged that fantasy, and damaged fantasies didn't sell movie tickets. The message was clear: her mind was worthless to Hollywood. Only her body and her willingness to appear stupid had commercial value. What Hollywood couldn't control was what Marilyn did in private. Her correspondence with poet Norman Roston, discovered years after both their deaths, revealed a woman who wrote with sophistication about art, politics, and philosophy. In a 1955 letter, she discussed Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety, relating it to her own experiences of fame and public performance. "Everyone sees the character I play," she wrote, "but the anxiety comes from knowing the real me is invisible." These weren't the words of the giggling blonde in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. They were the observations of someone engaged in serious self-examination. But she could share these thoughts only in private letters to trusted friends. Her friendship with writer Carson McCullers, which began in 1954, provided another glimpse into Marilyn's hidden intellectual life. McCullers initially assumed Marilyn would be the Hollywood stereotype. Instead, she found someone who'd read all her novels, who wanted to discuss themes in McCullers's work, who asked intelligent questions. They spent hours talking about literature, with Marilyn reading passages from books she'd brought, discussing her interpretations. McCullers would later write in her journal that Marilyn Monroe was one of the most intellectually curious people she'd ever met. "She's trapped," McCullers wrote, "between the woman she is and the character everyone needs her to play, and the gap between those two identities is killing her slowly." In February 1955, Marilyn Monroe did something that shocked Hollywood. She moved to New York and enrolled in Lee Strasberg's Actors Studio, studying method acting alongside Marlon Brando and James Dean. The press treated it as a publicity stunt. But for Marilyn, the Actors Studio represented the first time in her professional life that intelligence was valued over appearance. Lee Strasberg was initially skeptical. His skepticism lasted exactly one class session. When Marilyn performed a scene from Eugene O'Neill's Anna Christie, Strasberg saw something he'd seen in only a handful of actors in his decades of teaching: the ability to access genuine emotion, to transform completely, to disappear into a character with technical precision and psychological depth. After class, he pulled her aside and told her she had the potential to be one of the great dramatic actresses of her generation, but only if she was willing to stop playing the dumb blonde in her own life. That conversation began a mentorship that would change Marilyn's understanding of herself and her craft. Strasberg introduced her to the psychological theories underlying method acting. For Marilyn, this meant confronting the trauma of her childhood. But it also meant acknowledging her intelligence, recognizing that the performance of stupidity she'd perfected for Hollywood was itself a kind of method acting. Strasberg worked with her on separating Marilyn Monroe the character from Norma Jean the person. This was revolutionary for Marilyn, this permission to stop pretending, to let her mind be visible. For the first time since becoming famous, she was in an environment where intelligence wasn't a liability but an asset. The other students at the Actors Studio quickly realized they'd underestimated her completely. She arrived early to classes, stayed late asking questions, read every book Strasberg recommended. Actor Eli Wallach later recalled being stunned by her preparation. She'd come in with questions about motivation that showed she'd been thinking about the character for days, he remembered. But when Wallach suggested she should let the public see this side of herself, Marilyn shook her head. Hollywood had already decided who she was allowed to be. Deviating from that character meant risking everything she'd worked to achieve. While Marilyn was discovering her intellectual potential at the Actors Studio, Hollywood was working to undermine her transformation. Gossip columnists ran stories suggesting she'd gotten too big for her britches, that she was abandoning the fans who'd made her famous. When she announced in 1956 that she wanted to form her own production company, the industry's response was brutal. Studio executives told journalists that Marilyn couldn't possibly understand business. What terrified them wasn't that she might fail. What terrified them was that she might succeed, that she might prove an actress could be both intelligent and successful. Because if Marilyn Monroe could reveal herself as intellectual and still maintain her career, it would expose the lie that Hollywood's system was built on. The psychological toll of living this double life manifested in increasingly severe anxiety and depression. Marilyn's dependence on sleeping pills and alcohol escalated. Her therapist, Dr. Margaret Hohenberg, wrote in her private notes that Marilyn was suffering from identity fragmentation, a sense that the public persona had consumed the authentic self. In therapy sessions, Marilyn would speak eloquently about philosophy and literature, then break down crying because the world only wanted her to be pretty and dumb. "I feel like I'm in a cage made of my own face," she told Hohenberg. "Every time someone looks at me, they see what they want to see, and what they want to see has nothing to do with who I actually am." Her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller in 1956 seemed to offer a solution. Miller was a Pulitzer Prize winner. His willingness to marry Marilyn suggested she must be more than the blonde bombshell. And for a brief period, their marriage seemed to provide the intellectual partnership she craved. They read together, discussed literature and politics, but even this relationship contained the seeds of the same pattern. Miller was working on a screenplay called The Misfits, but when she read early drafts and offered suggestions, Miller dismissed her input. Her job was to perform his words, not question them. When she persisted, Miller told friends she was being difficult. The betrayal of discovering that even her intellectual husband saw her primarily as a beautiful muse devastated Marilyn. She found his diary by accident, left open on his desk, and read entries describing his disappointment that she wasn't as intellectually sophisticated as he'd hoped. These assessments were false, but they revealed something Miller couldn't admit. He'd wanted the fantasy of the beautiful woman who admired his intellect, and he was discovering instead a real person with her own intelligence that sometimes challenged his assumptions. The marriage deteriorated rapidly after she read that diary. By the time Marilyn returned to Hollywood in the late 1950s, the psychological damage of her double life had become severe. She was drinking heavily, taking increasing doses of barbiturates, arriving late to film sets or not showing up at all. The narrative Hollywood constructed was brutally simple. Marilyn Monroe had gotten ideas above her station, tried to be something she wasn't, and the stress had broken her. This explanation allowed the industry to avoid confronting its own role in her deterioration. When filming Some Like It Hot in 1958, director Billy Wilder complained about Marilyn requiring 59 takes to deliver the simple line, "It's me, sugar." What he didn't understand was that her difficulty wasn't about acting ability. It was about the psychological impossibility of continuing to perform stupidity after years of being told that performance was all she was worth. The tragedy of Marilyn's final years was that her intellectual life, rather than saving her, became another source of pain. She'd read enough psychology to understand her own trauma, enough philosophy to articulate her existential crisis, enough literature to see her life as tragic narrative, but that understanding didn't heal her. It made everything worse, because now she could analyze precisely how Hollywood had damaged her while simultaneously feeling powerless to escape. In her final months, she'd sometimes call friends late at night, reading passages from books, trying to explain connections she'd made between Dostoyevsky and her own life. These conversations would last for hours, with Marilyn speaking rapidly, brilliantly, demonstrating the sophisticated intellect she'd hidden for 16 years. Then she'd hang up, take more pills, and prepare to face another day of pretending to be the character Hollywood had created. On August 5, 1962, when Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home at 36 years old, the real story was about the systematic destruction of a brilliant mind by an industry that profited from denying that brilliance existed. The library discovered by the estate sale crew, those 400 books with their annotations and underlined passages, provided documentary evidence of what Hollywood had worked so hard to hide, that Marilyn Monroe was intellectually sophisticated, widely read, capable of complex analytical thinking, and forced to suppress all of it because intelligence threatened the profitable fantasy of the dumb blonde. When news of the library began circulating after her death, studio publicity departments went into damage control. Gossip columnists ran stories suggesting the books had been purchased by friends, that the annotations weren't really in her handwriting. This desperate need to maintain the lie even after Marilyn's death revealed how threatening her intelligence had been. The people who'd known the real Marilyn tried to set the record straight. Lee Strasberg delivered a eulogy emphasizing her intelligence and artistic potential. Carson McCullers wrote an essay describing Marilyn's literary sophistication. Norman Roston published some of her letters, but these testimonials were largely ignored or dismissed as romantic exaggerations. The truth, that she died because Hollywood wouldn't let her be something she actually was, remained too threatening to be widely acknowledged. In the decades since Marilyn's death, the discovery of letters and testimony has gradually revealed the intellectual life she'd been forced to hide. Researchers have documented her library, analyzed her annotations, constructing a picture of someone engaged in serious self-education throughout her adult life. The woman who emerges bears little resemblance to the character in her films. Instead, we see someone reading Dostoyevsky and Freud, studying Russian literature at UCLA under a false name, discussing existentialist philosophy in private letters, approaching acting with intellectual rigor. But this revelation hasn't fundamentally changed how Marilyn Monroe is remembered. The image that Hollywood constructed, the profitable lie of the beautiful idiot, remains more powerful than the documentary evidence of who she actually was. When people reference Marilyn today, it's almost always as the sex symbol. The posters that sell her image show the character from The 7-Year Itch, not the woman sitting in her library reading The Brothers Karamazov. This erasure of Marilyn's intelligence serves the same purpose in death that it did in life. It protects the fantasy that beautiful women exist primarily for male visual pleasure, that they don't have complex inner lives that might complicate that fantasy. If Marilyn is just a pretty victim, her death doesn't indict the system that destroyed her. But if we acknowledge that she was brilliant, that she was forced to hide that brilliance, that the suppression of her intelligence directly contributed to her death, then her story becomes an accusation against Hollywood's entire apparatus of female objectification. These questions remain relevant because the system that killed Marilyn Monroe continues in its fundamental logic. The entertainment industry still profits from female objectification, still encourages women to emphasize appearance over intelligence. The 400 books in Marilyn's library, carefully preserved now in various archives, stand as testimony to the person Hollywood wouldn't let her be. Each annotated page, each underlined passage represents an act of quiet resistance, a private assertion that she was more than the character everyone wanted her to play. She read Dostoyevsky because her mind demanded engagement with complex ideas. She studied philosophy because understanding existence felt more important than performing in another forgettable comedy. She annotated Milton and Joyce and Freud for her own benefit, building an intellectual life in the only space Hollywood allowed her to have one, in secret, in solitude, in the darkness of her bedroom after everyone who needed her to be stupid had gone home. The tragedy is that this private intellectual life became another burden. Every book she read reminded her of the gap between who she was and who she was allowed to be. In the end, Marilyn Monroe's story isn't about a beautiful woman who died young. It's about an intelligent woman who was forced to pretend otherwise, who built a secret intellectual life in the shadows of fame, who read Dostoyevsky while Hollywood sold tickets to movies that required her to act like she could barely read at all. It's about the psychological cost of that sustained performance, the damage inflicted by forcing someone to hide the very qualities that make them feel human. It's about a system that valued her body while destroying her mind, that made her rich while keeping her imprisoned, that turned her into an icon while ensuring that icon bore no resemblance to the person she actually was. The 400 books remain, their annotations still legible, their underlined passages still bearing witness to the mind that read them, but the woman who built that library is gone, And the industry that killed her continues, largely unchanged, still selling the same lie to new generations, that beauty and intelligence are incompatible in women, that thinking is less valuable than appearing, that the performance of stupidity is what makes female celebrities profitable. Marilyn Monroe spent her entire adult life trapped in that lie, and it killed her. But the lie survived her death and continues, immortal and profitable, in every image that reduces her to the character she was forced to play, rather than honoring the person she actually was.